non-traditional and traditional students to participate. 126 or 25 people to come, and $3,900 of grant funding coming from the Alumni Association, the Paul and Lisa Welch Foundation, the assessment mini grant. I built this project into the assessment of our departmental programs so that we can get an extra $1,000 from the school. Really slick way to put a survey on something and to then include it in the assessment of the program. So if you all have funding like that, you can do a workshop or something, and you can add a survey system, a pre and post survey to it, and that makes you eligible for the money. So just thinking about creative ways that you can get money for your projects by looking at the money that is currently available at your institution. So always think about, create a list for yourself. This is all the grant funding that faculty can get, and then think about, what do I need to do with my project so that I can get this money? And there you go. So thank you.
Thank you.
Rachel.
Okay, I'm Rachel, and this is our team project, Multicultural Education, Integrating the Community and the Academia, and I had a really great time, and I believe everybody else did too. You know, it was a wonderful experience, and we were looking at the transformation through multicultural education. And from what we found, transformation will occur when people participate in a multicultural education workshop. And this is done when we were looking at it through three, we know when it comes to transformation, there's different hypotheses in how it happens. And we found three factors. And the first one occurs with when people are willing to listen. I think that's always a key. Are you willing to listen and open up your mind to different perspectives and new ideas? And once that happens and everyone is willing to participate and become an active listener, and you are able to transform people through the experience of this workshop.
The second factor is our ability to reteach pedagogy. So what process are we going to use to show somebody that this is important? We chose the video. So we chose a video as opposed to having myself introduce all of this information as an African American woman. We chose a video that would take 27 some odd different clips and provide perspectives from all different angles as opposed to using somebody's centered perspective. So what are we going to do? Use very creative methods, very creative pedagogy to reteach history. So we want to relearn what we've learned in the past from a different perspective and then take time to think and to let that marinate. And then maybe 2 months from now, something will happen and you'll remember something from that video. And then it'll have a larger impact. It doesn't have to happen today. But as long as you were listening, it could matter.
And the third thing we did was we said, okay, let's look at pluralist programs. So we're looking at diversity. Let's do inclusive policies. And basically what that would do is introduce or trigger an awareness in that person. So they're like, well, what are some of the stereotypes I didn't know about, or what are the biases I'm carrying, or the idea of privilege? And so when we looked at using pluralist programs, it was a way to start introducing what Rachel said. How do we get them to participate or be interested? And then also, how do we now introduce new pedagogy? If we're trying to change policies, we need to change how we're teaching. And so pluralist programs really incorporates the other two to then be an agent of change. So what we ended up realizing is that we cannot really predict change, but multiculturalism approach was really a great way to plant a seed towards changing all people's minds.
Of course, before you do anything, you got to do a lit review, as we all know. A good old lit review. And so when we were looking at all our resources and, you know, extracting information, we discovered there are about 8 really main ideas to help us with this workshop. And of course, one of the first ideas that we learned is team learning, you know, team building. And this is what we're doing right here. right now in this conference is team learning, listening to new ideas, fostering new perspectives. And maybe, like Dr. Howard-Bostic said, maybe today, oh, okay, well, that sounded nice. Maybe in 2 months I'll go, oh, wow, now I understand what they were telling me. And so it's very important when it comes to multicultural education to include everybody in the process.
Also, we need to understand what the experiences are of diverse students. We saw that with the presentation yesterday, doing a survey to find out, what their experiences are. We decided to just do a literature review, as opposed to doing a survey to find out what those experiences were with regard to how do you reduce racism, how do people adapt to the workforce in general, because remember, we were talking about students, we were talking about community members, and, we were also talking about the faculty. So we had to look at factors, and so these were the core areas in the lit review that provided a decent amount of information where we can come to conclusions. There was not a lot of information about how students transition in the workplace, or what are the experiences of diverse students over time. There were some longitudinal studies, there were some studies about their experiences right now, but obviously it seems to me that studies on multicultural education among students and their experiences over time, that's new. That's a hot topic. So if anybody's interested in doing any research, this is an area that is very, very weak. And so perhaps you might want to pick up this topic of looking at the experiences of diverse students and, how they enter the workplace and what their experiences are while they're on campus.
And the literature review also talked about the importance of communicating about diverse groups. So I think you mentioned going through school where civil rights, you talk about it for 30 minutes, and you don't really get exposed to really the stories or the fabric of what's happening within certain cultures. So the literature talked about the importance of really having people talk about diverse groups so that you could really get the understanding of where do you stand around certain issues, what are your perspectives, what, like I mentioned before, your stereotypes, the biases that you might not be aware of. And so, like I said, the literature really said in order to really promote transformation, you have to get into that uncomfortable position. And sometimes, like I said, it's really getting integrated, listening to other people's stories, sharing your perspective, and really being able to cultivate an atmosphere where everybody's respecting each other, but also a place where we could, like I said, identify biases and privileges, but also challenge ideas, because if you don't really do that, sometimes you end up just remaining very monotonous. So you want to challenge those ideas, and as you do that, you end up probably being able to promote a more respectful and understanding environment that could really help with the transformation of each individual.
There were 3 different workshops. Everybody has access to those workshops. You all did the symbolic interactionism workshop with segment 2 of the video, okay? So usually the symbolic interactionist workshop we do with segment 1, but I really wanted to talk to this group, a more mature group, about white privilege and about bias. Typically you would start the workshop off with the transition into history and understanding how these things develop. But given the nature of given the experience of our group, I thought it would be more effective to just go right into a topic that would get you all thinking and communicating. So I want you to think about that if you decide to do this workshop. You can, in fact, depending on who you're working with, you can mix and match the workshops and use different segments of the video for them. But you have to think about who it is that you're talking about and how beneficial that particular workshop will be for that group. So we have 3, symbolic interactionism. This one we did with the panel. So we had a panel we actually had 3 different panels. So every time we showed a segment of videos, we had panelists from different areas of study or different positions. So we had a total of 14 panelists, community members, faculty members, alumni, students. We really worked with, who were funding us. We had to have alumni on that panel, right? because we were getting the alumni to fund us. So we really thought about the grant money, and we thought about how we played that out. And we also thought about age. We thought about diversity. There were, we had a gay man, right, who was Hispanic, you know, on the panel. We had an African-American man who was middle-aged. We had an African-American pastor who was a senior citizen. So we really thought about making the panel as diverse as humanly possible, so that when the panelists watched the video and they provided their initial, you know, perspective of what it was that they got out of the video, everybody was blown away by some of the perspectives that were introduced, because they were coming from so many different angles. So we tried to be strategic in having a very diverse panel. The next segment was about critical race theory, right? So we used conflict theory and critical race theory to look at the segment that you watched. So the segment that you watched was about privilege, and it was about bias. So we used center critical perspectives, right, to get people to think about biases and to think about myths and how those myths impact how people live and how they see the world. You all used symbolic interactionism, and I think the results, the responses were different, actually, using symbolic interactionism for that second workshop. So I was actually amazed and blown away by the responses that we got from the second workshop, using a different perspective to talk about it. So I think it would be interesting to actually do each segment using each perspective to see what would actually come from it. But it would take, you know, a little time. Perhaps if you watched the video in your class over semesters, you would decide to use different workshops to see what types of responses you might get from a variety of different groups. But the response for symbolic interactionism was totally different in this group than it was with the workshop. So thank you for that. That was amazing to me, how that played out. And then the last workshop is about functionalism, or structural, about institutions, you know, about institutional racism, right? And how the rules and regulations in society can impact your ability to be upwardly mobile. So that's what the third workshop is all about. So here you look at policies, you look at procedures, you look at barriers. Like, I'll give you an example. When I was a little girl, our books in the classroom were chained to the desk. So we couldn't take any books home. And people would put gum in the books, they would scribble on the books. So all that you have to work with is this book that is chained to the desk, that has been vandalized, because it's not important. So then it gives us an understanding that education is not important, and we don't have a capacity to learn. That's an institutional barrier for children, that they don't have a book to take home, and that they're in jail in school because there's a chain on the book.
And of course, you know, with any research, you gotta see what the results are. And what we found between the pre and the post survey was transformation did occur. 85% of the post survey participants said, you know, I learned something new, I gained new knowledge, and I thought the documentary was a really good use of my time. And so we found that very positively, you know, reinforcing that we need to instill this multicultural workshop in different areas. Also, what we found, which was interesting, was there's a change of dynamics, and the sense that participants came in thinking, okay, I really know about multicultural education, I know about diversity, and we found that 25% said, okay, yes, you know, it was good, I learned some more information. But then 11.4% said, hey, I didn't even know what I thought I knew, I didn't even know. So it gives them a different perspective. And as we know, that when it comes to changing people's, and not saying changing people's minds, but trying to help plant seeds into people, you have to expose them. And what I found really interesting is some of the comments. And I think by watching our segment, the third comment, I realized things that I don't think twice about being white. And so when you start seeing that maybe this person, maybe that day it happened, would say, okay, this is some new information, but maybe 2 months from now, they might say, okay, now I really understand what this means, and I'm going to help transform someone or speak up for somebody if I see a situation. So I found that very positive in our workshop in helping introduce people to new ideas and perspectives.
Okay, so how did we get our data? mathematician. Okay, so actually we ended up doing principal component analysis with our data. And what principal component analysis does is it compresses your factors. So when we started before, we had 34 variables, and that is just like different themes, okay, that we were filling out from our survey. And once we put it into SPSS, what it does, it just repositions all those words, all those variables, and finds similarities to them. And after that, we were able to come up with 8 that had similar themes. And from this data, what we found was that actually some of those factors that came out were positive and some of them were negative. So it wasn't like, oh, everything is great. But even the negative stuff informed us about the power of using this model to really introduce ideas and hopefully, like I said, later on help with transforming someone's mind. So the negative ones we had were factors number 4, 5, and 7. So 4 said, learning with students, small groups, teams is not a good use of my time. So like we said, we try to have a very diverse group. We had different age groups, we had professors, faculty, students. And inside joke we have is that maybe sometimes it's not as effective to be working with someone who is not really as maybe motivated as you at that time, things like that. So it's interesting that we captured that. And in terms of informing just work they do in the future is maybe trying to see, well, should I have, when I do try and do these projects, should I really look at that readiness for someone to want to do this? Because it could have been more impactful if everybody was ready, but it's great that we get to see that even though people don't think that it's a good use of their time, that people are still talking about it. And I mean, sometimes that's more important than maybe necessarily trying to just not have the conversation at all. For number 5, we had not able to resolve conflict or communicate well with individuals or groups. And I mean, some of it is the content. People don't know how to communicate about this. But like we're saying, we're planting those seeds right now so that in the future they'll be able to have these conversations. And then 7 was did not perform well in workshop during panels. And these were specifically for our panelists. And we think what we captured that was because, or what we think is maybe we should have given them the video a couple of weeks or days before the actual event, because that was for some of the panelists their first time seeing the video. So they maybe feel like they were ready to contribute as maybe as effectively as if they maybe had some time to watch the video first and then reflect on it before the actual day. So in terms of like moving forward with that, that's something we talked about, maybe changing the timing of when we produce the material to our panelists. But the rest of them were really important and they were positive in terms of like Rachel talked about when it comes to knowledge, people were really interested in it, they learned, they felt like they improved their knowledge and understanding about the material. They enjoyed interacting in diverse groups. And like sometimes, like you said, people want to talk about it, but it's like, where do I do that? So providing that space so that we captured that, and people in group learning was helpful and beneficial. And so even though we couldn't in general generalize our data to say, okay, well, if you use everything, it's going to be the same result, what we could say from our data is that it's impactful in trying to instill or is planting those seeds towards transformation. It's not guaranteed, like I said before, that will impact change, but it's a good starting place for is planting those seeds. And basically that was the data we had, and overall, like I really, as a student, enjoyed doing this project. I'm part of the MLT team, so that's a multicultural leadership team, and we got everybody involved. And in a sense, it really introduced me to a lot of my privileges as well, things that you might not even know about. And so I really enjoyed the project and having the opportunity to dialogue with other people on campus and get into those uncomfortable spaces. But in general, like Dr. Bostic mentioned, it really helped inform and even help with giving us some data to advocate for other student services on campus. Like I said, I'm part of Pan-African Student Union as well, and this information really helped when we had to go talk to student organizations about instilling new programs for minority students.
And that's our presentation.